I'm Nic Harcourt, and we've got Hanna Berryman on Zoom from London. She's the director of the movie we've been telling you a little bit about this last week, Rockfield. And well, first of all, it's lovely to meet you. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on.
I watched your movie last night, and as I told you before we started recording, I was a teenager when that place first opened up, and I can remember bands that I was listening to, like Man, who were a Welsh band at the time,
Yeah.
who made a bunch of records there. So I'm aware of this place from way back, but had no idea that it was A, still in business, and B, how many amazing artists had been through there in the last 60 years. Obviously, the film goes through that, but tell us a little bit about how you got involved and how you came to make this documentary.
Well, I'm a big music fan and music doc fan, and I'd seen Muscle Shoals, and it was about 2015, and I just thought, I wonder where the British really unusual studio is like that. And came across Rockfield, and I kind of think I'd heard of it, but I just hadn't thought about it, and I couldn't believe it when I read the roster of people that had recorded there. And so I just called them up, and the same family was still at the helm. It still had loads of animals. The couple in there, nearly 80, was still at the helm. And I just thought, this is really unusual and kind of amazing. So I went down to visit them and got on really well with the family. And that was the start of it. You know, they'd never told their story before. They had all sorts of things they thought about it. But we just made a relationship, and we spent the next few years making it happen.
So when you say the next few years, I mean, how do you make a documentary like that? I mean, obviously you've got the place itself, and there are people there, but then you've got to try and reach out to people who've recorded there and been there and collect their stories. Can you take us through that process?
Sure. So we started, it was pre the massive boom that we have now in music docs here. So in a way it was lucky, because me and my producer, Kat, we're not the big guys, you know, and we formed a relationship with the studio. But we didn't have loads of money, so we had to raise a bit of money from Film Wales, and then, you know, we kind of raised bits and bobs of money, and through the time we started getting in touch with the artists who'd been there. But what was great is that we started, I think the first person we filmed back in 2016 was Robert Plant, and then we filmed Coldplay maybe the same year. And it was amazing, the kind of breadth of people, but they all, you know, they had their start there. And Rockfield's quite a special place, and people often went there when they were nobody and became somebody's there. And so they were keen to sort of give back to this story of the studio. And I think that's what really helped us, that people came on board, because it's a really important place. And I guess it's a moment in history now, really, of residential recording, which will never quite be the same again. So it felt like people were happy to contribute to something that was important to tell future generations, I guess.
As I was watching it, I was seeing that there were clearly a couple of different generations of the farm, of the studio. When they first built it, the two brothers, they were actually in a band themselves, right? And their whole idea originally was just to record themselves.
Totally. Yeah, they'd gone to London, they'd looked at an address on a record label and realised they turned up at a sort of record pressing factory instead of the label.
Instead of the offices,
And
yeah.
yeah, and they didn't get signed anyway, so they came back a bit disgruntled and thought, well, we've got a lot of space here, maybe we can just record ourselves. And one of the brothers, Charles, was particularly talented at kind of building things. And so he got set about it, and it's kind of piecemeal like that. It's very sort of homemade as a place, and I think the film was a bit like that. It came together in dribs and drabs, and I think it was all the better for it. You know, it's really a real thing, and so was the studios.
There's some amazing stuff being recorded there, but also some amazing antics that have happened there through the years, from the various artists that have been through there. I think the first guy that we speak to in the documentary is Ozzy Osbourne, who talks about going down there with Black Sabbath. I don't know which record it was for, but very early on in their career.
Paranoid. Yeah, they were
How did
rehearsing.
was it Paranoid that they did there?
They were rehearsing it there, yeah.
Right. How did you get a hold of Ozzy, and how did you get him to participate? Did you have to come out to Beverly Hills, or was he back home? How'd you get him involved?
unfortunately, we had to come to Beverly Hills.
Oh, that's terrible for you. Yeah.
So yeah, that was really good. And he was, I mean, that he wanted to do it, and his memory was really, really clear on everything that had happened there. And you know, they were recording in at the time they were rehearsing in a community centre in Birmingham, which is just like a place where sort of, you know, you have old people meetings, stuff for children's things. You
Sure.
know, people sort of turn the noise down and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
turn it down. So that, you know, they got to Rockfield. It was amazing. They could kind of make all this noise. They swam in the river. They were shooting guns. They were doing God knows what else. And I think it was a pretty wild place back then. And Hawkwind obviously talk about that too. And I kind of love that idea because it feels so far from now. Like Hawkwind were there for years, just recording. And also he says just doing whatever. And I think you hear all that in the music. Like you hear the times people had in the music in Rockfield, I think. And that's what we were trying to show, that music is a real thing and it comes of a dynamic of people and where you are. And there's an exuberance or not. And that's what you hear. That's why it's important.
There's a number of bands who have been there and spent a year or more there. And as I was referencing, there seem to be different generations of the studio, different incarnations perhaps of the studio, maybe that's the word I'm looking for, where you go from the 70s and into the 80s, and then Simple Minds and the whole new romantic thing is happening. And then the studios seem to sort of, I don't know if it fell on hard times, but they were definitely not doing too well at the end of the 80s until the Stone Roses came along.
Totally. I mean, that was really hard times for that kind of music. It was guitar music, dance music had come along, and there was a recession, and suddenly it was like, are we going to survive? And then Kingsley at the helm got a call from John Leckie, who he'd worked with before. John Leckie, the producer, brought Simple Minds up. And he said, I've got this band called the Stone Roses and I want to bring them down. And that was the start of the changing fortunes of Rockfield, because suddenly there was a huge boom in guitar bands in Britain again. And Stone Roses were followed by Oasis, and it just all happened again. So yeah, they had a rocky time there, keeping it surviving. You know, it wasn't easy.
I would imagine that when a band comes in for a year, first of all, that saves the studio, right? Because you're going to be busy for a year. And back then, record companies still had budgets for sending bands away and spending millions of dollars.
Yeah.
Stone Roses didn't participate in the movie. Was there any particular reason?
I think a couple of them and ahed about doing it, so it wasn't like a complete no. And obviously they helped us in terms of clearing stuff and the records. I think, I don't know if you saw the story of them in the film, it sort of makes sense, doesn't it? Like every time they were supposed to turn up for something, they didn't. And, you know, they it's sort of like, I feel like in the end, the fact that they weren't sure they wanted to do it now, I mean, it's a very complicated time for them. They were there for years, and, you know, some of the time they were producing not very much. So, but what they did do there was brilliant and survives the test of time, as John Leckie says. So I kind of felt in the end, after the umming and ahhing, the fact they didn't do it, it sort of was fitting. I'm kind of glad that reflects the spirit of the Stone Roses. They're captured in their way that they were when they were in the studios.
You reference the guitar band explosion that happened after them, and then the whole Manchester scene, of course, that came about, and a whole bunch of those bands seemed to make the trek down to Rockfield. Oasis were there, and you've got some great footage with Liam and Bonehead. You've got footage with Tim from the Charlatans. Did you figure out, as you were in the process of talking to these guys, why they all followed the Stone Roses? Was it because that album was a touchstone and they wanted to be where that had been made?
Partly, and also a lot of those bands were following bands that had been there back in the 70s as well, in the 80s. So each generation influenced the others, and they all went back there, you know. And then when Coldplay went, they went because Stone Roses and Oasis and people had been there. So everyone kind of followed people that they'd liked that had been there before, definitely.
And then that next generation, obviously, Coldplay went there, and their debut album was made there, which was another, multi-platinum, million-selling album around the world. Every time that somebody went there and had a massive album, it seemed to be that they were just booked relentlessly onwards from that. How are they doing today? What's going on there today?
Well, like Kingsley says, they've got a three-pronged approach, like a milking stool, which he says a milking stool has three legs and it stays steady. And that's partly recording, partly they do workshops, and partly they do B&B. They have people come down who make the pilgrimage to Rockfield and want to hear Kingsley tell his stories, which he's very happy to do. So you can stay in Rockfield if you want to, and it's a fantastic place to stay. And you do pick up the vibe there. So they follow all those things. And I think the truth of it is it was a moment in history, and I don't think residential recording's ever been the same again. There's not that sort of money given to new bands to go and just spend weeks or months in a place like that. And that was why it was important to do the film as well. It was like a moment in time, and that's fine. Time moves on and people can record anywhere now and in their bedrooms, but maybe there was something about the dynamics of bands that you take somewhere like that, a lot of them from the city, and they spend all this time in the middle of the countryside, the middle of nowhere, and it can go very, very wrong or very, very right. And I think that's amazing. So we were sort of trying to look a bit at the kind of creative process, really. And I don't know, the same countryside that Wordsworth was writing about and the inspiration of, I think these musicians, that there was inspiration there too.
When I first came to the States a little over 30 years ago, I went to Woodstock in upstate New York. And at the time there, Bearsville Studios was there. Unfortunately, it closed down a few years back now. As you said, it's hard to keep a residential studio going. But there was something about living in a small town and seeing rock stars in the local pub or in the local health food store. It seems like a very similar thing. And I know that from my time there and having conversations with bands who were working up there, they loved the idea of just getting out of town, going somewhere where they were not distracted, except for by themselves and their excesses.
Which happened a lot.
Yeah, exactly. And living somewhere and getting up and just living and breathing music the whole time.
Yeah, so different. I mean, Coldplay, before they got to Rockfield, they'd been recording in London and it just hadn't been working. And the record company basically said, well, you can go to Rockfield. This is kind of make or break. And I think, music isn't like that, is it? You don't go into the office and then come home and that's how it works. When you're at Rockfield, you can get up at 3 or 4 and you can stay up all night recording, and time sort of stands still a bit. And that's rock and roll, isn't it? Like that's how it should be, I think, maybe a bit. So yeah, Rockfield's definitely a sort of tribute to that era.
There's some fantastic stories, and obviously we're going to encourage people to go to the US premiere, which we're helping to host coming up on the 13th of May. So we don't want to give too much away, but what I did want to just discuss quickly before we finish up is I think there's so many moments in that documentary where we get to see a little bit of an insight perhaps into the artistic process. But you're talking to Chris Martin, and I've known Chris a few years from way back at the beginning as well. And I've never heard him tell the story about how Yellow came about. And he tells it in such a beautiful offhand way almost.
Totally, yeah.
About how he was sitting in the studio and this happened and that happened. And then he thought it was going to be, that Stars was going to be the not Yellow, it was going to be Stars. Because look at the stars. And then all of a sudden he looked at the Yellow Pages and that was it. The song was born. And that's the kind of thing I think that makes this documentary so unique, that you hear people telling these stories about creation.
And I hope so, because it was like I've done lots of docs in other subject areas, and it wasn't like I didn't go to them as kind of superstars. I just went to them as people and wanted them to take me back into that moment. And that's what I think that the interviews are great, because everyone was really generous with their kind of time, and they went back into those moments, and you can see Chris reliving that moment. And that's what's special. So I hope people get a lot out of hearing that kind of thing.
Well, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. I'm going to have to sort of look down here right now to get my information. But the screening, the US premiere of Rockfield, the Studio on the Farm, is at the Regency 16 Theaters in Van Nuys in the beautiful San Fernando Valley here in Los Angeles.
Wish I could be there.
Be there. You can get your tickets through the website at 885fm.org. Support this public radio station as well by doing that. Thank you so much for taking a minute, and thanks for making this movie about a place that's made so much music that I've loved and listened to over the years.
Thanks so much for having me, and I hope everyone enjoys the film at the premiere.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks, Hannah.
Okay, bye.
88.5 FM, KCSN, and KCSN HD1 Northridge, Los Angeles. KSBR and KSBR HD1 Mission Viejo. A service of California State University Northridge and Saddleback College. Member-supported public radio. Streaming on the web at 885fm.org.